Hello and welcome to the Everything is Black and White podcast. It's time for the view from the opposition, and this week it comes from Jonathan Johnson from CBS Sports. He's based in Paris and follows PSG amongst other French teams. Jonathan, thank you very much for popping onto the podcast. Familiar listeners of the podcast will remember Jonathan way back when Newcastle signed Bruno Guimaraes. He came on and introduced us to the Brazilian midfield, and it's gone quite swimmingly for Bruno since then. Jonathan, how are you keeping? Are you well?
Yeah, doing very well. Thanks. Thank you very much for having me back on, and looking forward to getting into this one. And yeah, as you've seen seems Bruno's slotted in quite nicely at St James's Park.
Yes, he's been absolutely superb, and fingers crossed that talk of a new deal will be announced sooner rather than later, because we know there's lots of vultures flying around him, because he's been that good. This is a view from the opposition, Jonathan, that I dreamt of doing, but not as quickly as it has come around. I mean, to be facing PSG in the Champions League, just to say Newcastle United in the Champions League still blows my mind. And to welcome PSG as the first side to St James's Park in the Champions League after 21 years, it's quite something. Just before we get into PSG, what do you think when you see Newcastle in the Champions League?
I mean, for me, it's a throwback to a couple of decades ago when I was growing up. Obviously, I was still in England at the time, so it was before I went to France. And I remember some of Newcastle's forays in Europe, not just in the Champions League. And it's I think it's a fan base that a lot of European fans would readily admit is a welcome addition to the Champions League circuit, and certainly an away day that I know a lot of PSG fans have been looking forward to since the draw was made.
Yeah, well, PSG have just landed as we press record there, the touchdown in what is actually a sunny Tyneside this afternoon. And we understand that the PSG fans, I think over 2,000 have got tickets. They'll be taking over the Newcastle's big market come Wednesday afternoon ahead of the game. So that should be quite an interesting one. I'm not sure many people would choose the big market as a location, but that's where they are heading. PSG, one of the best teams in you. When the draw was made, it was described as a group of death for Newcastle. My conclusion, as well as many other fans and reporters as well, you want to face Europe's best, and PSG are that. However, someone said to me yesterday, well, actually, you could also describe them as one of the serial underachievers. Would that be fair?
I don't think it's unfair. I certainly think in terms of what PSG set out to achieve when they were taken over by Qatar back in 2011, they haven't quite hit the heights that was expected of them. They did have a period where they were sort of serial quarterfinalists at the beginning of the project, and sort of at that moment, everything seemed to be on track. But then, aside from the final appearance in 2020 and the semi-finals in 2021, you could say that things haven't quite gone to plan, because they've mostly gone out in the round of 16, and often in quite spectacular fashion, especially since the original remontada in Barcelona. So I think there is a recognition that PSG could have done better in a number of those editions, and people would also point to the extenuating circumstances that sort of led to PSG being finalists in 2020 in the first place. Obviously, Lyon as well got to the semi-finals in that same truncated edition of the Champions League. But also at the same time, PSG are regularly recognised as sort of one of the pre-tournament favourites, or at least one of the teams that's expected to make a deep run each time. And their group stage performances generally are quite convincing. So I do see why. In one moment, people sort of see PSG as these continental giants, and equally at the same time, they're kind of the continental giants that people would want to face, because they've not quite gotten the results that have been expected of them. And I actually published a piece on Monday about sort of how Newcastle could probably learn a lot from PSG's first 10 years of their project, certainly in terms of not setting too ambitious a goal too soon. The same goes for Manchester City as well, because obviously the scenario is quite similar as well. So, I think that PSG is sort of an example of what not to do in many ways for Newcastle to be wary of as the years go on. But it's always a big moment when a club returns to Europe after many years away. PSG had that at the beginning of their Qatari project as well, and I think in terms of the group of death scenario, people really wanted to call this a group of death. And I actually think that when you look at it and delve more into sort of the teams and where they're at the moment, it's not the best moment for Borussia Dortmund. PSG are, sort of mid overhaul once again, but this time it's been a more deep reaching overhaul. Newcastle are still sort of in the early days of their project. They're in the infancy, and Milan are not quite the force that they were a couple of years ago when they won Serie A. So I wouldn't necessarily agree with the people who do think that it's a group of death, but equally at the same time, it's hard to have drawn too many clubs with more pedigree than the group that Newcastle have landed in.
Yeah, I think this is the one Newcastle fans are really looking forward to in terms of that home fixture. I think Dortmund's going to be a fantastic trip. Milan was, and Paris will be. But in terms of the team out of the Milan Dortmund, I think this is the one PSG that the most looking forward to. And it's interesting that you mentioned the project, because I think that's where a lot of people, maybe outside of Newcastle, were drawn to the comparisons between the ownerships. When you talk about lessons to be learned, you mentioned there, not being too ambitious. Is that the main takeaway you think, the likes of the Public Investment Fund and Amanda Staveley and co will take away from Paris's project of the last decade?
No, I don't think it's that you shouldn't be too ambitious. I don't think for a project like this that you can ever say anything is too ambitious. I think there's certain temptations that come when you want to be ambitious, and it takes away from actually building a squad that's set up and constructed to succeed, as opposed to just going for sort of the shiniest, glitteriest, newest item on the market. And that's the trap that PSG fell into. And Manchester City also went through it for a period as well. Both of them ran into massive financial fair play issues, which Newcastle would do very well to have paid attention to, and sort of how PSG and City have built their brands, since those run-ins with UEFA. But I think the biggest takeaway from what PSG have done over the last couple of years is should have taught Newcastle that basically star power doesn't guarantee success. And I think if we can really praise Newcastle for one thing and one thing alone since the beginning of the Saudi-backed project, that's that there hasn't been a temptation to rush into the market and find the biggest name available for the biggest price. Most of the targets have been intelligently selected. We discussed at length Bruno Guimaraes, way back when he signed. Sven Botman followed him as well. Both came from Ligue 1, both very intelligent, transfer identifications and acquisitions. And a number of other, intelligent additions have been made to the squad as well, including Isaac in attack. So, I think basically the big takeaway for Newcastle should be to continue along the route that they've started along, and to not, perhaps give in to temptation if there are a few sort of bumps in the road on the way.
Yeah, I mean, that's you're 100% right about the approach in the transfer market. Everyone outside, again, of Newcastle expect them to go big. I mean, we've seen links to Mbappe, Neymar before he left Paris, and Newcastle just haven't done that. They've been very sensible in their approach, and it is paying off at the moment. In terms of PSG's start to the season, it's not gone perhaps as well as they would have liked. They're fifth in the table at the moment. 12 points from their first 7 games. I mean, that's me just looking at it and making a conclusion that it has gone wrong. Has it gone wrong? Or again, because of where they are at the stage of a rebuild, maybe they weren't expected to be, at the top of this stage?
I mean, I think it's easy to say that it's not gone according to plan, and obviously PSG would have expected to have more points on the board by this point. But equally, at the same time, there's a bit more patience around Parc des Princes these days, and they know that the squad has been overhauled once again, and they're trying to rebuild not just the starting 11, but the squad, and also the chemistry and the cohesion between the players. And that it doesn't come overnight. We've got a new coach in Luis Enrique. A new group of players. Obviously Kylian Mbappe is still the star name, but a much bigger French core than there was before. So, there's a lot, that's kind of changed behind the scenes, and you can't just expect, to be dominant from the very start, when you make sweeping changes as PSG have made. Now, the hope obviously is that they don't have to keep making sweeping changes like that every summer, until they finally get it right. There is a feeling, though, that this is a more united PSG side and more of a team than we've seen in the last couple of years. They rely less on individual brilliance than they used to when they had the likes of Messi, Neymar. So it's going to be really interesting to see this particular test, because it's away from home. It's a tricky game. It's one that's got a bit more riding on it than you'd expect, given sort of the geopolitical aspects, given the two clubs' ownership groups. And that certainly ratchets up the pressure on PSG, because there will be an expectation to not lose this game. And like I said, it's very much a work in progress, this PSG side under Luis Enrique. So a really interesting test. But I would say that PSG have generally risen to the task so far this season in the bigger games. Beat Lens at home, beat Lyon away, thrashed Marseille in the derby, beat Borussia Dortmund in the Champions League opener. So it's these kind of games that the squad shows itself to have an appetite normally.
And talk to me about Mbappe. I mean, that's the player everybody wants to see. I think it was last week or the week before when it was rumored he might be out. He picked up, I think it was a calf, some sort of calf injury. There was devastation from a lot of fans that actually he wouldn't play, because obviously he's absolutely fantastic. But that's exactly what Newcastle fans want to see. They want to see the best at St James Park under the lights. Obviously, he's recovered from whatever that was. Started the game on Saturday. How is his form been? Because I've read a few things that he's a bit out of sorts so far this season.
Well, I think first and foremost, you have to bear in mind that Mbappe didn't really have much of a pre-season. There was such a furore around his potential future that he barely featured during PSG's pre-season games. So he's been sort of playing catch-up from the very beginning in terms of his match fitness, which makes the numbers, his goals scored so far this season, even more impressive, given that he didn't play for sort of the first match and a half, and then picked up that injury and missed the majority of the Marseille game as well. So it was actually an ankle knock. He did, go the full 90 against Clermont in the goalless draw over the weekend. So it does look like those Newcastle fans who've been desperate to get a glimpse of Mbappe will get exactly that. And it's, this is the kind of game as well that he likes, playing in. We've seen PSG go away to the likes of, Manchester United in recent years. And, this will be one that Mbappe and a number of his PSG teammates relish. But obviously, he is still very much the talisman of this team, and Luis Enrique is very glad to have him at his disposal after not being able to call on him for the majority of the preseason.
The key question is, how did Newcastle United stop him?
It's a good question. I mean, when he's on form, he is very difficult to stop, very difficult to contain. I think the one thing that could stop Mbappe is not necessarily anything that Newcastle, can do themselves, but it's actually sort of the developing chemistry between PSG's front three. Mbappe, Colomwani, Dembele know each other from the France national team, but playing together for PSG is very different to playing together at international level. Also, something of importance to PSG when they've played and been more convincing so far this season has been the midfield. Ugarte, a former Newcastle target, sort of anchors the midfield, and then you've got the very talented teenager Warren Zaire-Emery just playing a little bit in front of him, with Vitinha, who spent a bit of time with Wolves as well. So I think Mbappe might not be at his most lethal best if PSG continue to have those teething issues in the attack. But make no mistake, it is a quality attack that PSG have assembled, and you've also got players like Gonzalo Ramos who can come in and provide a goal threat as well.
Yeah, name Newcastle fans will remember, because he was heavily linked to Newcastle United over the last 2 windows, but he has arrived in Paris. If you were sitting down with Eddie Howe, Jonathan, and he said to you, what is Paris's biggest weakness that I can exploit, what would you tell him?
I think it would probably be the setup in the defence, because while PSG tried to play like a flat back four, obviously Hakimi likes to get forward, so there's potential to get in behind him on the left. Also, you've got Luca Hernandez on the left, who's now sort of treading a bit of a tightrope at the moment because he's the only sort of fit senior option at left back. I'd say the actual sort of weakest link to target based on the performances so far this season would actually be someone like Milan Skriniar. But Newcastle's job would be a lot easier if Ugarte and or Marquinhos were missing out, because they're two very central figures to what Luis Enrique is trying to do with this PSG side. So I think the obvious person to target for this game would be Skriniar, who didn't play much over the second half of last season with Inter and has been recovering from back problems. So he's still not quite back to his best.
Do you expect PSG to have a lot of the ball on Wednesday, or do you expect them to invite Newcastle onto them?
I think PSG will try and get a fair bit of the ball. At the end of the day, Luis Enrique does preach sort of a possession-based style and likes to see his players, knocking it around, with confidence. But I really think key in dictating, whether PSG will have a lot of the ball or not, is whether Ugarte in the midfield can win that battle up against Bruno Guimaraes and the Newcastle midfield. So whoever comes out on top of that, I think, can realistically hope to potentially control the game through possession and maybe dictate who comes out on top.
And just a penultimate question before I get your score prediction. How are PSG looking at this? Do they come to Tyneside knowing that they're favourites, thinking they're favourites, and thinking, we ought to be winning this game?
I think PSG will feel that they're favourites, and I think most people have painted them as favourites as well, which is understandable. I mean, this is PSG's 12th consecutive Champions League appearance and Newcastle's first in 2 decades. So, I think that aspect of it is logical. But I think PSG are also well aware that this could potentially be a bit of a trap game for them as well, where the stakes are a bit higher than they would usually be for a game of this sort of stature, given the two clubs' ownership situation, and the fact that there's obviously going to be a bit more expectation from the hierarchy than there perhaps has been so far this season. But equally, at the same time, PSG generally don't tend to need to be favourites in the group stage, because they're normally quite consistent and performing well at that stage. It's later on where things start to fall apart. So this will be a good test, and one where they have to live up to the tag of favourites. But equally, I don't think they'll be coming to St James's Park expecting for Newcastle to just roll over. They know that they're going to be in for a physical battle when they come up against Premier League sides, and this will be a good test of Luis Enrique's achievements and what he's been able to put together with this PSG team so far.
And the final question I want to ask you is about St James's Park and the atmosphere. We know War Flags, the supporters group, have gone above and beyond for their first Champions League display. And we know, look, Paris's games are an unbelievable spectacle. So they're not going to be kind of intimidated by that. But I'm just wondering whether they might make the mistake of underestimating the atmosphere on Wednesday. Do you think they're going to be aware of what's going to hit them from the terraces?
I don't think PSG will underestimate it. Obviously, they are used to having quite a boisterous home atmosphere, so it's not something that phases them too much. And I think they know that big European nights, at a venue like St James's Park, are always going to generate electric atmospheres. And I think something else as well that will really factor into the great atmosphere overall is the fact that PSG generally tend to travel well in terms of supporters, and have some very vociferous backing when they go to places like they've gone to in the past, Old Trafford, for example. So I think there's going to be a lot of PSG fans relishing this trip, and they'll definitely try and make themselves heard.
It's going to be a fantastic spectacle, I think, for everyone there, as well for the neutral as well. All that remains to be done then, Jonathan. How is Wednesday going to go? What is your score prediction?
I've been saying that I am still confident that PSG will come out on top. So what I'll say is maybe a 2-1 win for PSG, which is bold in itself, because I know Newcastle have a great defensive record at the moment. But PSG winning by a goal, I think, is generally sort of where I'm heading.
Thank you very much for that score prediction. I hope you're very wrong with it, though. To you guys listening and watching, do hit that subscribe button through whichever platform you're joining us on. Thank you very much to Jonathan for giving us the insight into PSG. Head over to our website, chroniclelive.co.uk, for all the latest Newcastle United news, including Eddie Howe's press conference ahead of the game on Wednesday and live coverage of Newcastle United versus PSG in the Champions League.